Rebuilding the Chicago Bears offensive line should be priority number one this offseason. So we're going to go through some of Ryan Poles' different options and how to prioritize free agent spending with the NFL draft.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, I want to go through how to rebuild this Chicago Bears offensive line, sort of from a mock offseason standpoint. Not that we're going to do every signing across the whole roster, but kind of go through what the different options and dynamics might look like for the offensive line specifically. How you pair different free agent signings with different NFL draft possibilities, and sort of weighing that against the need to address other positions on this roster, knowing that you can't sign all of the most expensive free agents at every position, and you can only use your first-round pick on one guy and only use your early draft picks, on one player each. There is a limit to your resources and how you allocate them between two guards, a center, maybe a left tackle upgrade, and then everything else on your Bears roster. I think there's a lot of different considerations for Ryan Poles to consider here. And it starts with the idea that free agency comes first. And you can't go through free agency while also knowing, you can't know what the NFL draft is going to bring you. The draft will be an unknown for you as you go through free agency. It's one thing when you're doing these hypotheticals and you're like, well, okay, if I can just slot in Will Campbell at left guard, then I don't have to sign a left guard, and I can just sign a center and a right guard, and then boom, I'm rebuild my interior offensive line, and that makes my plan super easy. But Ryan Poles can't go through the process banking on a specific player being there in a specific draft slot that the team wants them to be. Same thing with other spots. Oh, I can just bank on getting my starting center in the second round, so I don't need to sign one in free agency. I can put all my money in on a couple of big name guards, and then boom, solve the center position in free agency, and then you're good to go. Like, maybe you can go into the draft saying, hey, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a chance to get an interior offensive lineman with one of my first four picks, in the first three rounds there. But it's a risky ball game. Like, can you get through free agency with leaving an obvious hole on your Bears offensive line and then count on the draft to fill that hole? Because all of a sudden then you're drafting for need, right? Not best player available. And maybe the best player available ends up being at a position of need, but you don't really want to go into the draft feeling like, man, I have to get my starting left guard, my starting center, whatever position it is. You don't want to go in the draft saying, I have to find a starter for this year in this draft, because then you're really forcing yourself to have to pick a specific player at a specific position instead of trusting your draft board. So then if you go into the NFL draft knowing that you want to fill all of your holes in free agency, that means signing three new offensive linemen, three new starting caliber offensive linemen. So then you can go in the draft saying, hey, I don't have to take an offensive lineman. I can if they're best player available, but I don't have this need that I have to fill. But right now, of course, as the Bears offensive line sits, you don't have a left guard under contract. You don't really have a starting caliber right guard under contract. The only center under contract is Ryan Bates. Like, they're going to need to fill all of those spots in free agency. And you can't necessarily afford to go out and get the most expensive player at all three of those spots. I mean, in theory, could you literally afford it? Yeah. You could sign center Drew Dahlman from the Falcons and Will Freeze from the Colts to be one of your guards, and then maybe Mekhi Becton as your other guard, or you could trade for Trey Smith from the Kansas City Chiefs and give $20 million to Trey Smith and $15 million to to Drew Dahlman and $15 million to Will Freeze, and then have the most expensive interior offensive line in football and have no money left to sign a new starting pass rusher opposite Montez Sweat, or to sign a number 3 wide receiver better than Tyler Scott, or to bring in a number 2 tight end with much production or experience, as a top flight option there. Like, yeah, in theory, you can find a way to make the numbers work, but most likely the Bears are not going to sign 3 big name, top flight, expensive offensive linemen. Maybe they make 1 big splash, or maybe even 2 big splashes. But if you do 2 big expensive offensive linemen, then maybe you got to go cheaper with the third one there. Or maybe you do 1 big one and a couple of middle tiers, or a big one and a middle one and a cheaper one there. Like, it depends on how much you're going to want to spend at pass rusher, right? Does somebody like Trey Hendrickson from the Bengals become available in that conversation? Or do you want to go after Josh Sweat or Milton Williams, right? You're balancing how much to spend on O-line versus how much to spend on other needs for this team. But I start to split this free agent group into a few categories. There's the most expensive guys that are going to cost you, $15+ million. There's the mid-tier guys that are maybe more in the $8 to $12 million range. And then there's the cheaper guys that are going to be likely, 8 and less, so $7 and less million a year range. When you talk about trying to rebuild this interior offensive line, like can the Bears get both, say, Drew Dahlman and Will Freeze, who are both, probably going to be $15 million a year type offensive linemen in free agency? Maybe. But if you're putting $30 million in those two, you're not going to have much left for that other spot. That other guard's going to have to be a cheaper player, maybe Evan Brown from the Cardinals, who, he's okay, but not necessarily a player you're super jazzed about having been able to sign. But I don't know, if you come away with 3 mid-tier guys, like maybe you get Josh Myers from the Packers at center, and Mekhi Becton from the Eagles at right guard, and Aaron Banks from the 49ers at left guard. Like, okay, none of those are Pro Bowl caliber players. All 3 of those guys have flaws or things you might not love about them, but they could all be upgrades over what the Bears had last season. So is that satisfactory there? Because then at least you go into the draft saying, hey, I don't have to take an offensive lineman anywhere. I don't need to find my starting offensive lineman in the draft, but I can take offensive linemen and develop them for the future there. But all 3 of those guys I mentioned are young and would probably sign multi-year deals. So it's an interesting balance that the Bears have to strike here between short and long term, between price tag across different needs. Do you sign 3 guys to 4-year deals and then lock them in for the long term? Or is there an advantage to going cheaper with a veteran player like Kevin Zeitler from the Detroit Lions, who won't cost as much as the top guys? Or you could throw Brandon Scherf from the Jaguars in this conversation, and is only going to be a 1 or a 2-year fit in your team. But you sign a player like that with the plan to most likely take an offensive lineman this year to develop from the draft and become your future starter. So you get to have the salary cap savings and also draft and develop players, but you're not forced to draft that player. If you go with a veteran guard like Zeitler or Scherf and you don't draft one, you're not screwed, right? It'd be ideal to draft one, but you're not forced to draft one if the board just doesn't align that way. Like, are you almost better off in that reality over the long term going a cheaper veteran at one spot with a rookie behind him to give you perhaps better play and cheaper play over the next 4 years, as opposed to mid-tier free agents that sometimes you love and sometimes maybe you don't love quite as much? And so I want to go more specifically into those dynamics of trying to balance veterans versus younger guys, longer term versus shorter term, expensive versus less expensive, and go through some different Bears offensive line options when you start to mix the NFL draft into this conversation next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. On FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can always stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Whether that's the NBA or the college basketball action, baseball season right around the corner, hockey, soccer, tennis, boxing, and you can even bet on the upcoming NFL draft. They've got it all in the FanDuel app that's super easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. How Ryan Poles juggles the different variables in this offensive line is going to be interesting here, because when you start to think about, okay, get through free agency first, then the NFL draft, it makes it harder to fit a first-round offensive lineman into your offensive line. We talked yesterday about Will Campbell from LSU, Kelvin Banks from Texas, Armand Membo from Missouri as potential first-round options for the Chicago Bears with the 10th overall pick, and whether or not you move those guys into guard or tackle. But if we go through free agency and say the Bears sign a left guard, a center, and a right guard, where, 3 starting caliber players on the interior, in theory then, your starting lineup is pretty set with Braxton Jones at left tackle, free agent starting left guard, free agent center, free agent right guard, Darnell Wright at right tackle. So then if you go into the draft and you want to take an offensive lineman with your first round pick, they pretty much have to be a left tackle then, right? Like if you sign 2 starting guards and a starting center in free agency, can you draft a guard in the first round with the 10th overall pick? Because if you've signed veteran free agents at that position, then there's no room for that first round pick to start, because you're not going to give a free agent a big contract and then move him to the bench as soon as you draft the first round pick at his position. But you don't want to draft the first round pick at the position and have them sit their whole season on the bench, especially as a top 10 pick. So if the Bears are going to draft an offensive lineman in the first round, it almost has to be someone that will play left tackle. They have to see Will Campbell as a left tackle if they're going to take him in the first round. Because if they take him as a guard, are they going to leave a hole open at guard throughout free agency, counting on the chance that they might or might not get Will Campbell in the draft? Like, they have to fill all 3 of those holes in free agency. But if you fill those holes, there's no room for a first-round guard. So then your only first-round pick on the offensive line would have to be someone you trust at left tackle to take the starting spot above Braxton Jones. That, or you leave a hole to fill in the draft that you force yourself to play. I mean, the only other possibility there is like, okay, like maybe you draft, Will Campbell and play him at left tackle at first, and then eventually you could kick him inside the guard. And but there's not really a clear path for someone you only view as a guard to be taken with that first round pick, assuming you fill all of your holes in free agency, because you want to fill all your holes in free agency so you're not forced to take a guard in the draft and reach at a position that you just feel like you have to take instead of being able to just sit there and take best player available. And so that makes it tricky to kind of go through this process of like, okay, how do you then parse out this draft? And I think if I think about some different offensive line options for the Bears, I think you can either go heavy in free agency, heavy in the NFL draft, or try and balance a mix of all of those. And that's where I want to go through like 3 different offensive line combinations here that sort of fit each of those potential narratives. So like if we say like option 1, let's start with more of a balanced style of heavy, like a little bit of free agency and a little bit of draft, but not too much. So say you draft Will Campbell in the first round with the plan to play him at left guard, and you sign Drew Dahlman at center, and then maybe you go a little bit cheaper at right guard with Kevin Zeitler, where it's like, okay, you do your big free agent spend at center, and you do a big draft pick at guard. So it's like, bam, bam, you've got a great left guard and a great center added to this team. Maybe an older right guard who's still very good. So, man, you feel really good about that offensive line from left to right. You don't have to overspend in free agency. You don't have to use all your early picks to fix the offensive line. Just get one big free agent, one big draft pick, and then boom, you can kind of fill in the rest with lower free agents, lower picks. Maybe you draft another guy in the 3rd round or the 5th round to add some depth there, but your starting lineup is Jones, Campbell, Dahlman, Zeitler, Wright. Feels like a pretty good offensive line. But then, what if you compare that and say, okay, well, maybe what if you go with the more extensive free agent spending option here? You go out and sign maybe the top guard available in Will Freeze to be your right guard. You sign Aaron Banks to be your left guard, and you give out 2 pretty sizable guard contracts. And then, you still use like a second-round pick on a center like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, who can also play guard, if you need to end up moving him around. And now you've got, boom, 2 really, really solid long-term options at guard with Banks and Freeze are long-term, 3, 4, 5-year contracts that you're giving out, maybe $10 million a year, $10 or $9 million a year to Banks, and 15, 16 to Freeze, or whatever it ends up looking like, and use a second-round pick on the O-line. So you could still use a first-round pick on a pass rusher and feel like you're really filling that side of the ball properly, but you're putting some significant free agent investment in the offensive line. And again, love the upgrades on the interior at all 3 spots. Maybe the more balanced approach is you don't spend as much in free agency, but you do a little bit more in the draft. And so you go like mid-tier free agents like Mekhi Becton from the Eagles, and maybe a veteran center like Ryan Kelly that's a little bit more of a short-term option. But then you double up on rookies in the draft. You get Will Campbell in the first round, and you're playing him at left tackle. You go and get like Donovan Jackson from Ohio State in the second, or probably has to be the second round, and play him at one of your guard spots. And all of a sudden, you've got Campbell, Becton, Ryan Kelly, Donovan Jackson, and Darnell Wright as your starting lineup. And boom, you've got 2 rookies that you feel great about in the long term. You've got a veteran free agent that you feel great about for the immediate term. And then, Ryan Kelly at center is more of a short-term center option, but you've got time to be able to turn over that position, and you give that veteran center presence for Caleb Williams. Like, I think in any of these 3 cases, you've built yourself a really nice offensive line with some short-term, immediate veteran experience that stabilizes the position, while also adding young talent for long-term development and growth. And I think in any of these spots, you're leaving yourself room to be able to address other needs, where it's like, if you use all your picks and all your cap space on the O-line, or all your big early picks and all your heavy cap space on the O-line, you're not going to have much room to sign or invest in the defensive line in other spots. But like in all these cases, if you're not overspending in free agency, then you can spend more money in free agency on defensive end instead of offensive linemen. Or if you're not using a first round pick on an offensive lineman, then you could use that first round pick on the defensive line and other needs in this draft. Or, if you're just loading up on draft picks on the O-line, then you can spend a bunch more, elsewhere on other needs on your roster. And I think that's how you start to see the different ways you can balance this out across the different levels of investment here. But I really want to hone in on how this balances out with other needs on this roster. Like, yes, okay, you put X amount of dollars in the O-line, how much does that leave for the D-line? You used these picks on the O-line, how much does that leave for the D-line? And how you balance not just this combination of offensive linemen, but it sort of gets down to like what's more of a luxury and what's not, and what has to be addressed clearly in a free agency, and what can you go into the draft maybe a little bit more flexible on as a means of filling your roster needs and then being able to get by in case the draft doesn't go exactly the way you want it to. So we'll take a look at some of those different dynamics with different positions on this roster next on Locked On Bears. In an ideal world, you're given a big contract to a center, a big contract to a guard, a big contract to a defensive end, and then you're still then able to use your first round pick on whatever you want, and your second round pick, you can use a first round pick on a running back, and boom, you've got all of this sort of luxury to play with here. But that doesn't feel super realistic based on where the Chicago Bears are right now. When you look at projected salary cap space, it's around $80 million. You're also going to have to re-sign a number of your free agents. You're going to have to sign your NFL draft class, all of your rookie contracts. You're going to need to leave some money for future flexibility to sign other free agents, emergency guys during the season. You want to leave a good $10 million for that. And all of a sudden, you've got some money to spend, but you don't have unlimited money to spend, right? So when we think about, the expensive free agents, somebody like Will Freeze costing, $15 to $17 million a year, perhaps. Somebody like Drew Dahlman costing $15 to $17 million a year. Somebody like Milton Williams and Josh Sweat costing, in the 17, 18, $19 million a year. Or Khalil Mack could be in that same sort of category here. Like, there's not truly enough money to go around to all of those guys. I think there's money for definitely at least one big free agent, but it feels to me like one big and two mid-tiers. And that feels like it's across all of your needs, not just the offensive line. Could you get Drew Dahlman and Khalil Mack? I mean, maybe, but then you're really going to be cutting it tight on the other two spots you want to fill on your offensive line, plus your number 3 wide receiver, plus your number 2 tight end. Like it becomes a real challenge there when you're trying to swing big on multiple guys high end in this free agent market. But it's sort of this question of like, what's most worth the big splash? Like, Ben Johnson has expressed a desire to have a really solid, reliable center for Caleb Williams. The way he talked about it to me at the Combine sounded like he was referring to a veteran center. He didn't say that explicitly, but I kind of got the impression that they don't necessarily want to have to rely on a rookie center for Caleb Williams there. So is someone like Drew Dahlman, as an experienced, quality, reliable center, worth that big splash as opposed to, an expensive pass rusher like Khalil Mack or maybe Josh Sweat versus someone who's going to be a little bit cheaper in Chase Young, right? Who's still not a bad player, but just more middle tier, right? Would you rather go expensive on the O-line and cheaper on the pass rusher, or cheaper on the pass rusher and more expensive on the O-line? Because I tend to come from a philosophy where generally, especially with the guard position more so than the others, you don't necessarily need to have a top 5 guard in the NFL. It's more valuable to have a top pass rusher than it is to have a top guard. That offensive line play, and you'll hear me say this all offseason, is about how bad your worst offensive lineman is, not how great your best offensive lineman is. It's about the weakest link more so than the strongest link. And so I find myself coming from a philosophy of like, spread the offensive line money around and don't concentrate it too much into one spot. I certainly don't think the Bears should trade for Trey Smith. I wasn't particularly on board with signing Trey Smith as a free agent, and so when you add in that I have to give up draft picks and then give him the same big contract I would have had to give him in free agency, I don't like having to put that much investment in that spot. I would much rather grab a couple of middle-tier free agent guards that aren't Pro Bowlers. They're not great, but they're good enough starting caliber players who you feel like are reliable and solid. If not, if they're not going to be spectacular, that's fine, because then I don't have holes there anymore, and I can use more of that money to make the bigger splash at a bigger impact position like pass rusher. Or if Ben Johnson really feels like center is going to be a higher impact offensive line position because of the relationship with the quarterback and their ability to call out protections, you can sell me on getting the top center in the market in Drew Dahlman a lot easier than getting a top guard on the market. And when you got Will Freeze coming off of an injury there, like I just feel like if you're comfortable with Becton or Aaron Banks or some of these other guys as solid options there, even Kevin Zeitler from the Lions, I would be totally fine with. I think he's a short-term option, but he's still a really, really good football player. And I think having the flexibility to still draft these guys is valuable as well. Like I want the Bears to use at least one of their 4 top 75 picks in this draft. They have 1 first-round pick, 2 seconds, and a third, all in the top 75 of this draft. At least one of those should go towards an offensive lineman, if not multiple of them going towards offensive linemen. But if you sign 2 guards and a center, all to 4-year deals, then there's really not much of a pathway for any of those early draft picks to make it onto your offensive line in a consistent role. And it feels like you're going to waste half of their rookie contract before they get to play, and you're not getting the real value out of that draft pick. Because again, like the draft pick's not about this year. It's about the next, 4 to 8 years of their first 2 contracts in the NFL. But if you're locking up a bunch of free agents to a bunch of long-term deals, then those draft picks end up feeling a little bit not wasted, right? Because you can never have too many offensive linemen, but you have to find roles and opportunities for them. But you also don't want to just like sign 3 free agents and then say, oh, I don't need to draft anybody on the offensive line. I'm good. That position is set, because you always want to have the next guys working in the background here. Now, at the same time, if you signed 3 solid free agents, you got Drew Dahlman and Mekhi Becton and Kevin Zeitler or whatever, and you got your starters, imagine the luxury that gives you to not need to use a pick on an offensive lineman if you don't want to. You could then take a running back in the first. You could take Ashton Genty in the first round. You could take a pass rusher in the second round. You could take a tight end in the second round. You could take a wide receiver in the second round. And then, in the third round, you could take, a safety to replace Kevin Byard in the future, or perhaps replace Jaquan Brisker in the future. You could take a linebacker to potentially replace TJ Edwards or Tremaine Edmonds as soon as next year. Like, there becomes a lot more flexibility in the draft if you go in the draft saying, I don't need to take an offensive lineman. And it's about whether or not you need that offensive lineman in the short term or the long term here. And that's what's going to be so fascinating for me, is how Ryan Poles approached this without the ability to know what you're actually going to have access to in the NFL draft. I think pass rusher is a little bit different, because it feels to me like no matter who you sign in free agency, there is always a way to get more pass rushers on the field, but there's not always a way to get more offensive linemen on the field. Like, yeah, you have offensive line injuries, and so you're likely going to have to go to backups occasionally here. But say you sign Khalil Mack in free agency, or Josh Sweat, or whoever you want. Say you sign a big-time pass rusher in free agency. I can still use my first-round pick also on a pass rusher, and you can rotate these guys in. Your pass rushers don't play 100% of the snaps in the game the same way that your offensive linemen do. And you've got the ability to move pass rushers to different positions. So you could kick Montez Sweat inside on third downs and get 3 defensive ends on the field. And then all of a sudden, that first round pick is playing in all of your key situations and having that high impact ability. Whereas, like, if you sign 3 starting free agents and then draft a guard in the second round, that guard's not going to play until there's an injury. And maybe it's more likely than not that there will be an injury, but how many games are they going to play for? How much of an impact are they really going to have? Whereas that rookie pass rusher can have an impact no matter who you sign on the defensive line. And that's where that position feels more valuable and feels like more of a priority. But you also have to make sure you're investing in the offensive line, right? It's not like, oh, defensive line is more valuable or more important individually, so just do that and don't worry about the offensive line. It's like, no, address the offensive line, but the defensive line is the place for the splash, the place to go over the top, the place to add more than you think you might need there, because they're going to be able to have that impact right away in the short and the long term. Whereas in theory, you go through free agency with your short term solved, and so any of your offensive line draft picks then are long term solutions there. And then, okay, are you using a second round pick on a guy that won't play for a couple seasons or won't play much for a couple seasons? Maybe. I think that's more tolerable in the third round with somebody like Karana Magaji. But when you got the 10th overall pick and then the 39th and 41st overall pick, you'd like all 3 of those players to be players that contribute right away and contribute for the long term if you really want to squeeze the most value out of them. Obviously, the most important thing is just get the picks right. Whether they play now or play later, if they're great players, just draft the great players and figure it out later. But that's what free agency is supposed to set you up to do. And that's what I really want to sort of hone in on today as we look at some different offensive line combinations. I want to look through some different defensive line combinations, and I want to look at more Bears free agent targets, all in the lead up to free agency starting next week. So there's a lot to still break down here in the Locked On Bears podcast. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you're looking for a second listen, now that we're wrapping up Locked On Bears, check out Locked On NFL, because I co-host Tuesday mornings Locked On NFL with Tyler Rowland. Podcast comes out twice a day, once in the morning with Tyler, once in the afternoon with Tony Wiggins. But Tuesday morning, as this podcast comes out, we talked about Aaron Rodgers to the Giants, T. Higgins getting the franchise tag, talked about Sam Darnold and where he could go, and we also talked about something else, and I'm struggling to remember what the third topic was. Oh, it was Aaron Rodgers. It was DK Metcalf to the Green Bay Packers and those rumors about the potential wide receiver movement there. So lots of good NFL talk for you over on Locked On NFL. Then come on back tomorrow, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.